the Phoenicians, the sailors who connected the ancient world. Welcome to History at Bedtime. Imagine a ship leaving the Atlantic coast of southern Iberia sometime in the 7th century BCE. We do not know the name of its captain. We do not know the names of the sailors leaning into the ropes, or the merchant checking jars and ingots in the hold, or the young deckhand watching the western horizon disappear behind them. No surviving ledger tells us that this exact ship sailed on this exact morning. But archaeology tells us that Phoenician merchants were here, at settlements along the coasts of southern Spain, trading in a region rich in silver and linked to the world the Greeks would call Tartessos. So the ship is not a remembered vessel. It is a reconstruction of hundreds of journeys that must have happened. Behind it lies Gator, the settlement that would become Cadiz, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. Ahead lies the narrow passage the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, and we call the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond that passage waits an inland sea more than 3,000 kilometers wide, crowded with islands, headlands, storms, pirates, rival merchants, and harbors where men spoke languages the crew might barely understand. The ship has no compass, no engine, no radio. It cannot ask the weather what tomorrow will bring. Its sailors know the coast, the winds, the behavior of waves near a shoal, the color of water over sand, the seasonal rhythm of the Mediterranean, and the stars that appear after sunset. They know where fresh water can be found. They know which headland means shelter and which bay can trap a ship when the wind turns. They know that a voyage is not a line drawn across a map. It is a sequence of decisions, each one made before the next shore is visible. In the hold might be silver from Iberia, amphory of oil or wine, salted goods, worked metal, ivory moving through long chains of exchange, or local products destined for markets far to the east. On the return voyage, the same network could carry fine textiles, carved objects, pottery, timber, glass, ornaments, and the deep purple cloth for which the cities of the Levant became famous. And somewhere aboard, perhaps scratched onto a jar, painted on a container, written on a shard of pottery, or remembered on a small piece of perishable material that has long since vanished, there may be a few signs recording a name, an owner, an amount, or a destination. The signs are simple. 22 consonants are enough to write the Phoenician language. Those letters will travel farther than the ship. Before we leave that deck, stay there for a little longer. The Atlantic swell is different from the protected water farther east. Even on a good day, the ship rises and settles beneath the crew with a slow motion that works through the knees and lower back. The hull is not large by modern standards. Cargo consumes space. Water consumes space. Rope, spare sailcloth, tools, food, amphory, anchors, and personal belongings consume space. Privacy is almost non-existent. A long voyage is not made from heroic moments. It is made from maintenance. A sailor checks a line because one loose fiber can become a torn rope under strain. Another removes water from the bottom of the hull. Someone inspects the steering oars. Someone else watches the seams. Food must be protected from spray and vermin. Fresh water must be rationed without becoming so precious that men weaken. A cooking fire aboard a wooden vessel is useful and dangerous. So much eating is simple, and meals depend on what can be stored or purchased during stops. The crew does not spend every night beneath a perfect dome of stars in the middle of an empty sea. Much ancient sailing is coastal, cautious, and opportunistic. A ship hugs known shore when that is sensible, crosses open water when geography requires it, and seeks shelter when the wind gives warning. A captain who has survived for 20 years is not necessarily the man who took the greatest risks. He may be the man who knew when not to sail. That judgment is part of the cargo too. Knowledge lives inside people. One sailor knows the approach to a harbor in Sardinia. Another has cousins in Carthage. A merchant remembers which family at Motia can be trusted to weigh silver fairly. A helmsman recognizes the shape of a mountain on Sicily before anyone else. A deckhand learns that a particular wind entering the Strait of Gibraltar can turn a comfortable passage into a struggle. None of this is written on a chart that survives for us. Much of Phoenician navigation disappeared because it was carried in voices, habits, and bodies rather than in books. The youngest men learn by watching. They learn that a rope is never simply pulled. It is pulled at the right moment. They learn that a sail is not merely raised or lowered. It is adjusted to wind that changes by degrees. They learn which stars are useful and when they disappear. They learn the smell of land before land can be seen. They learn the difference between the color of deep water and the pale warning over a shoal. They learn the way seabirds behave near coast. They learn that an experienced sailor can become silent when the weather is changing before the sky looks dangerous. And they learn fear. A culture famous for seafaring was not a culture without fear of the sea. Sailors feared storms because storms killed sailors. They feared reefs because reefs did not move aside for skill. They feared pirates because a merchant hull loaded with valuable metal was an invitation. They feared sickness, spoiled water, damaged masts, lost anchors, and coastlines whose rulers had changed since the last visit. Ancient trade routes look stable on maps because a modern line can be drawn cleanly from Tyre to Cyprus, from Carthage to Sardinia, from Gator to the Atlantic. The men aboard never saw that line. They saw the next headland, then the next. The network existed only because people repeatedly crossed the empty spaces between them. As our imagined ship approaches the pillars of Heracles from the Atlantic side, the coast narrows around it. To the north rises Iberia. To the south lies Africa. Currents meet. Winds can accelerate through the strait. The sailors know that entering the Mediterranean is not merely steering east. It is timing movement through a place where sea and weather funnel together. The merchant may be thinking about silver prices in Carthage. The captain is thinking about water, wind, and rock. The deckhand is thinking about whether he will be sick again. Farther east, no one in Tyre knows whether they are alive. That uncertainty is essential to the story. Long-distance commerce did not connect the ancient world because information moved instantly. It connected the ancient world despite delay. A family could invest wealth in a ship and then know nothing for months. A ruler could send an order west and receive an answer after political conditions had already changed. A merchant could depart with news that a king was alive and return to discover a new king on the throne. The sea joined places together, but it also stretched time between them. Every returning ship, therefore, brought two cargoes. One was visible: metal, jars, timber, cloth, ivory, glass, wine, oil, tools, ornaments. The other was news. A harbor learned who had died, who had rebelled, which port was safe, where prices had risen, where war had closed a route, which ruler demanded tribute, which island had suffered drought, which foreign merchant wanted purple cloth, which colony needed settlers, which god had supposedly saved a crew in a storm. People waited for ships because ships carried the world back with them. And the people who became famous for carrying that world had begun as inhabitants of a coast so narrow that the mountains seemed to push them toward the water. But to understand why they are aboard at all, and why a people from a narrow strip of coast at the eastern end of the Mediterranean could build a network that reached the Atlantic, we have to travel backward before we travel east. Long before anyone used the word Phoenician, the coast of what is now Lebanon and parts of neighboring Syria and Israel was already tied to the great civilizations around it. Cities such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre did not suddenly appear after 1200 BCE. They were old places built over older places, ports whose histories reached deep into the Bronze Age. Byblos had traded with Egypt for centuries. Egyptian rulers wanted the timber of the Lebanese mountains, especially cedar, and the coast offered something the Nile Valley lacked in abundance: long, strong trunks suitable for roofs, monumental buildings, ships, furniture, and sacred objects. Egyptian influence reached north. Levantine goods traveled south. Craftsmen borrowed images and techniques from one another. The sea already connected worlds before the people we call Phoenicians became famous for crossing it. One story from the years after the Great Bronze Age kingdoms began to weaken lets us hear this change almost as a conversation. It survives on an Egyptian papyrus usually called the Tale or Report of Wenamun. The text is literary and cannot be treated as a stenographic record of one diplomatic mission, but it preserves a world in which an Egyptian envoy travels north to obtain cedar for the sacred bark of the god Ammonius. In earlier centuries, an Egyptian official might have expected royal authority to open doors automatically. Wenamun discovers a different Mediterranean. He loses money. He argues. He waits. He is questioned. At Byblos, the local ruler does not behave like a subordinate trembling before Egypt. He asks what payment has been brought. He points out that previous rulers paid for timber. He reminds the Egyptian that ships, labor, and cedar have value. The scene is almost painfully human. A representative of one of the oldest great powers in the world arrives expecting prestige to do part of the purchasing. A coastal king answers with accounts. Even if the narrative has been shaped for literary purposes, that argument captures a structural change. Egypt remained powerful, but the old Late Bronze Age order had fractured. Levantine ports possessed more room to negotiate. Their rulers could use access to timber and ships as leverage. The cedar itself becomes the center of diplomacy. Men in the mountains must fell trees. Laborers must drag the trunks. The timber must reach the coast. Ships or rafts must be prepared. Payment has to satisfy people at several levels. The sacred project in Egypt depends on an entire supply chain controlled by communities outside Egypt. This is the world from which Phoenician maritime power grew. But the people of that coast would not have called themselves Phoenicians in the broad way we do. A man from Tyre was a Tyrian. A man from Sidon was a Sidonian. Someone from Byblos belonged to Byblos. Their dialects were closely related, their gods and customs overlapped, their craftsmen shared techniques, and outsiders could recognize them as connected. Yet there was no single Phoenician kingdom stretching along the coast with one capital, one royal dynasty, and one army. The word by which history remembers them came largely through Greek eyes. That matters because the absence of political unity was not a small detail. It shaped everything that followed. Imagine sailing north along the Levantine coast. A city appears. Beyond it, another harbor. Then another. Each has its own ruler, temple, elite families, rivalries, agreements, and memory. A marriage between royal houses might create an alliance. A dispute over territory or trade could create hostility. One city might submit to an empire while another resisted. One might prosper while a neighbor declined. They competed even while speaking related languages and participating in the same commercial world. This fragmentation was dangerous when Assyrian armies approached. It was also flexible. If one port suffered, another could continue. If one dynasty fell, merchants elsewhere still sailed. There was no single palace whose destruction could end Phoenician maritime life across the coast. The political map was divided, but the sea connected what kings did not unite. That helps explain why the period after about 1200 BCE was so important. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the end of the Late Bronze Age disrupted older systems. Palaces burned. Some kingdoms vanished. Trade contracted in some places and changed direction in others. The reasons were multiple and remain debated: warfare, internal rebellion, migration, political breakdown, climate stress, famine, and the fragility of systems dependent on long chains of supply, may all have contributed in different regions. The coastal cities of the Levant did not pass through this transformation untouched. Some were destroyed or reduced. Political relationships changed. Egyptian control weakened. Older centers such as Ugarit disappeared. Yet several ports that would later be called Phoenician survived or recovered. Survival created opportunity. When large palace systems weaken, they leave needs behind. People still want metal. Temples still need timber. Elites still desire luxury goods. Communities still exchange grain, oil, wine, tools, ceramics, and cloth. What changes is who organizes the movement. Smaller maritime cities could step into spaces left by older powers. This did not happen in 1 year, and it was not the execution of a master plan. No council in Tyre announced that the Eastern Mediterranean order had collapsed, and therefore the city would now create an international commercial network. The process was cumulative. A voyage that succeeded was repeated. A family established contacts in Cyprus. Craftsmen learned what foreign buyers wanted. A settlement abroad became permanent. A harbor acquired warehouses. A route became familiar enough that the children of one generation inherited it as ordinary. Ordinary is one of the most powerful forces in history. The first journey across a dangerous stretch of sea is an adventure. The 50th is a route. The 100th is infrastructure. The same transformation occurred in identity. A merchant from Tyre might spend years among people in Cyprus, then return home with a foreign wife, foreign objects, foreign stories, and children accustomed to hearing more than one language. A craftsman in Sardinia might use techniques learned in the Levant but adapt them to local tastes. A shrine could contain a god with a Phoenician name worshipped through customs influenced by local neighbors. A burial might combine imported jewelry with pottery made nearby. Expansion did not create miniature copies of Tyre everywhere. It created mixed communities. That is why archaeology often makes simple labels difficult. An object can be Phoenician in style, but made outside Phoenicia. A person buried with Phoenician goods may have local ancestry. A settlement founded by Eastern newcomers can become culturally mixed within generations. Language, religion, clothing, food, and family do not all change at the same speed. The Phoenician world was strongest precisely because it was not a single thing moving unchanged across the sea. It was a method of connection. Its cities learned to survive by making themselves useful to people more powerful than they were and indispensable to people farther away than armies could easily reach. Cedar was useful. Ships were useful. Purple cloth was useful. Metalworkers were useful. Information was useful. And a harbor where strangers could reliably exchange one thing for another was useful in almost any political system. That usefulness would allow the cities to prosper under conditions that should have made small states fragile. It would also attract the attention of empires that wanted a share of the wealth moving through them. Not from a sudden discovery of the sea, but from generations of learning that a narrow coast could possess something larger kingdoms needed and that ships could convert geography into bargaining power. Byblos was especially old in this relationship. Tyre would later become more famous in Western expansion, and Sidon would rise and fall in prestige at different times. But Byblos reminds us that Phoenician history did not begin with colonization. It began inside a much older Eastern Mediterranean conversation. That older world also shaped Phoenician religion and kingship. Temples were not separate from economic life. Royal authority, divine patronage, trade, craft production, and diplomacy overlapped. A king dedicated inscriptions to a god not only because he was personally devout, but because the god belonged to the public identity of the city. One of the most important early Phoenician inscriptions appears on the sarcophagus of Hiram, king of Byblos. Its precise date has been debated, but the inscription belongs to the early 1st millennium BCE and preserves a developed form of the Phoenician script. It is not a school exercise announcing that a new alphabet has been invented. It is a royal funerary warning, practical and political, using an already functioning writing system. That is exactly why it matters. The alphabet enters history not as a philosopher's abstract idea, but already at work inside a city that traded, buried kings, made treaties, worshipped gods, and negotiated with larger powers. Their geography encouraged that fragmentation. The mountains rise close behind the coast. The usable plains are narrow. Rivers are short. Large inland expansion was difficult, while the sea opened outward in every direction. Cyprus lay within reach. From Cyprus came access to copper and to routes farther west. Beyond Cyprus waited the Aegean. Beyond the Aegean, Sicily and North Africa. Beyond them, Sardinia, Iberia, and eventually the Atlantic. For people living where arable land was limited but harbors were excellent, the horizon was not empty space. It was opportunity. The same mountains that restricted agriculture provided one of the region's most valued resources. The cedar forests of Lebanon became famous throughout the ancient Near East. Cedar was never the only timber used, and modern images of endless, untouched forests can be exaggerated. But the reputation of Lebanese timber was ancient and powerful. Egyptian texts, biblical traditions, and Assyrian records all preserve the value attached to wood from this coast. Cutting a cedar was only the beginning. Logs had to be moved down steep slopes, hauled to the coast, assembled, loaded or floated, and delivered to buyers who might live hundreds of kilometers away. Every stage demanded labor, organization, negotiation, and knowledge of routes. Timber linked mountain villages, royal officials, merchants, ship crews, temple builders, and foreign courts. The Phoenician cities also became celebrated for manufactured luxuries. Metalworkers combined forms and motifs from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Aegean. Carved ivory panels made in Levantine styles appeared in palaces far inland, including the great Assyrian centers. Fine bowls moved across the Mediterranean. Glass vessels from the Levant were prized, although the later invention of glassblowing belongs to a Syro-Palestinian world of the 1st century BCE, long after the classical age of independent Phoenician city-states. The older Phoenician reputation rests on skilled glassmaking and luxury production, not on a simple claim that they invented every technique later associated with Sidon. And then there was purple. The color began inside sea snails. Along the coast, species of murex produced a secretion that, after careful processing and exposure, could become colors ranging from reddish purple to deep violet. The work was slow, unpleasant, and costly. Enormous numbers of shells were needed for small quantities of dye. Archaeologists have found great accumulations of crushed murex shells near production areas, the refuse of an industry whose finished product could be worth far more than the animals from which it came. The smell must have been extraordinary. A luxury workshop does not always look luxurious while it is working. Imagine heaps of shells beneath the sun, vats, workers with stained hands, salt, water, fermenting organic material, and a coastal wind that carries the odor toward houses nearby. Out of this came cloth that kings wanted. Purple became associated with status because it was difficult to make and difficult to imitate. Later Roman emperors would regulate prestigious shades. Byzantine court language would preserve the idea of being born in the purple. The political meanings changed over centuries, but the prestige of the color had roots in the Eastern Mediterranean workshops that made Phoenician textiles famous. The purple workshops offer a good example of how luxury could reorganize an entire local landscape. The valuable substance did not pour from a shell already purple. Workers had to gather the mollusks, open or crush them, separate the relevant tissues, and control a difficult chemical process whose results changed with species, light, concentration, and treatment. The liquid could look unimpressive before oxidation transformed it. The final shade was the result of knowledge accumulated through practice. That knowledge was valuable enough to remain attached to particular production centers. A royal customer was not simply buying color. He was buying scarcity, labor, expertise, and distance. The cloth announced that resources from the sea and skill from specialized workers had been concentrated into something ordinary people could not easily imitate. For the dyers, however, prestige belonged to someone else. Their work involved smell, waste, stained containers, shell refuse, heat, and repetitive labor. Luxury is often built in places elites prefer not to visit. The same separation appears in metalworking. A silver bowl in a palace looks effortless once polished. The mine that supplied the may be hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. The miners may never see the finished object. The sailors who carried the ingot may never know who bought it. The craftsman may copy an Egyptian motif requested by an Assyrian courtier using silver extracted in Iberia. One object can contain an entire map. This is why archaeologists care about things that look small beside wars and kings. A bowl, a shard, a shell heap, or an inscription can preserve connections that political history forgets. Goods like these could make a city wealthy. They could not make it safe. Behind the mountains, larger powers were growing. In the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded westward. Assyrian armies were not merchant expeditions. They were organized instruments of conquest supported by infantry, cavalry, siege engineers, taxation, deportation, and an ideology in which the king demonstrated divine favor by defeating those who resisted him. The Phoenician cities were rich, visible, and strategically placed. They possessed ships the Assyrians needed and commercial connections the empire could use. The kings of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos faced a problem that would return again and again in Phoenician history. They could not normally defeat a great land empire in open war. Yet the empire also benefited from keeping their ports productive, so tribute became part of survival. Assyrian reliefs and inscriptions show coastal rulers bringing valuables to imperial kings. The relationship was never perfectly peaceful. Cities rebelled. Kings were replaced. Sidon suffered devastating punishment under Esarhaddon in the 7th century BCE. Tyre, protected by its island position, could be difficult to capture even when its mainland possessions were lost. But the broader pattern was one of pressure and negotiation. Phoenician cities paid, supplied ships, accepted imperial demands, resisted when they believed resistance might succeed, and returned to commerce when it did not. This was not romantic freedom at sea. It was survival between powers larger than themselves. The Assyrian relationship deserves to be imagined from the Phoenician side for a moment. An Assyrian king could commission a relief showing tribute arriving in orderly procession. Metals, luxury objects, timber, perhaps exotic goods from distances the imperial court wished to claim symbolically as part of its reach. The image announces hierarchy. The great king sits at the center. Foreign rulers approach. But the same scene looked different from Tyre. Tribute was expensive, humiliating, and dangerous, yet sometimes cheaper than war. A city that paid this year might continue trading next year. A king who bowed before an imperial envoy could still govern his own harbor after the envoy left. Merchants could resent the demand while benefiting from the stability created by an empire's roads and markets. Political submission and economic opportunity could coexist uneasily. Rebellion therefore became a calculation, not a permanent national struggle. If Assyria seemed weak, a coastal ruler might stop payment, join neighboring states, or seek Egyptian support. If Assyrian armies returned stronger than expected, allies could vanish. The punishment for miscalculation was severe. Deportation, destruction, execution of rulers, and replacement of local dynasties were normal tools of Neo-Assyrian policy. Sidon's destruction under Esarhaddon in the 7th century BCE was a warning visible to every neighboring port. Imperial inscriptions celebrate the city's defeat and the removal of its king. Whatever local memories existed have not survived with equal force. Tyre's island position made its situation different. The city could lose mainland territory while remaining difficult to storm directly. Assyrian kings claimed victories over Tyre, imposed tribute, and restricted its hinterland, but the island's ability to communicate by sea complicated total conquest. The defense had a price. An island city depends on supplies. Fresh water, food, timber, and space are limited. The same sea that blocks an army can become a prison if an enemy controls nearby ports and coastlines. Tyrian security, therefore, depended on naval mobility and on relationships beyond the walls. Again, connection was not merely profitable. It was survival, and the growing pressure from the east made the Western Sea even more important. Consider what a single year in Tyre might feel like under that pressure. In spring, merchant hulls return from Cyprus and the Aegean. Warehouses fill. Dyers work. Timber comes down from the mountains. Sailors repair ships damaged during winter. Priests prepare festivals. Families negotiate marriages. Children run near quays where languages from several coasts can be heard in the same morning. Then an imperial messenger arrives. He does not need to conquer the city to change its mood. He carries demands. Perhaps tribute has increased. Perhaps ships are required for a royal campaign. Perhaps the king must appear before an Assyrian official. Perhaps a neighboring ruler has rebelled and Tyre is expected to prove loyalty. A demand written hundreds of kilometers inland suddenly enters every workshop because taxes have to be found somewhere. The palace calculates. Merchants calculate too. If silver is sent east as tribute, less silver remains for commerce. If ships are committed to an imperial fleet, fewer ships carry private cargo. If rebellion succeeds, tribute might disappear. If rebellion fails, the city could lose everything. There are no safe choices, only different risks. This is one reason Western settlements became more than distant opportunities. They were reserved spaces. A family with relatives in Cyprus, Carthage, Sardinia, or Iberia possessed options unavailable to a household rooted entirely in one city. Wealth could be distributed. Sons could manage branches abroad. Political exiles could flee by sea. Information from another coast could create opportunities before rivals heard of them. A network is a form of resilience. It does not prevent disaster. It prevents every disaster from happening in the same place at once. Now move west with one of those ships. The first major island is Cyprus, close enough to the Levant that its mountains can become part of a sailor's mental world. Cyprus mattered for many reasons, but copper is impossible to ignore. The very word associated with the island would later become entangled with the metal in European languages. Copper had been essential to Bronze Age economies, and Cypriot resources remained valuable long afterward. Phoenician settlement at Kition on the southern coast became especially important. Kition was not simply a warehouse planted on foreign soil. It developed as a city where Cypriot and Phoenician traditions overlapped. Inscriptions, temples, pottery, political authority, and trade reveal a place integrated into the island's complicated cultural landscape. A sailor from Tyre arriving there was abroad, but not among strangers in the deepest sense. He might find people who worshipped familiar deities, spoke a related language, or belonged to families tied to his own city by generations of movement. From Cyprus, routes opened farther west. Crete and the Aegean offered markets and competition. Greek communities were growing into their own maritime expansion. Contacts could be peaceful, hostile, or both over time. Traders do not need to admire one another to exchange goods. Sailors who fight in one decade may buy from each other's descendants in another. Then comes Sicily, where the central Mediterranean narrows and anyone moving east or west must think about the island. Phoenician communities established themselves mainly in the west of Sicily as Greek settlement expanded elsewhere. Motia, on a small island in a lagoon off the western coast, was ideally placed for maritime traffic. It offered protection, access to routes toward North Africa, Sardinia, and Iberia, and contact with local populations of western Sicily. Imagine entering the lagoon slowly. Open sea sailing gives way to shallow water. The crew watches for channels. Smaller craft move around the merchant vessel. Buildings appear close to shore. Goods are unloaded into a place already accustomed to strangers. A merchant may stay only days. A family living there may have been absent from Tyre for generations. Farther north and east, Greeks are building their own cities. The Mediterranean is becoming more crowded. Crowding creates conflict, but it also increases demand. More cities mean more consumers, more shipyards, more temples, more elites seeking prestigious goods, more farmers producing surpluses, more ports where cargo can be exchanged. Sardinia offers another kind of meeting. The island already possessed the deep traditions of Nuragic societies, whose stone towers and local networks long predated Phoenician settlement. Eastern newcomers did not bring history to an empty shore. They entered landscapes controlled by communities with their own power, metalworking, and sacred places. Coastal settlements such as Sulkais and Nora grew through interaction with this world. At first, a foreign merchant may need a local intermediary simply to know whom to approach. Who controls access to metal? Who can guarantee that pack animals arrive? Which local leader expects a gift before negotiations begin? Which sanctuary is safe for an oath? Which measure of weight does this community trust? Commerce is full of details too small for epic poetry and too important for merchants to ignore. A successful trader learns people as carefully as a captain learns coastlines. He learns who is insulted by bargaining too aggressively. He learns which gifts create obligation and which create suspicion. He learns that imported luxury can become local political language. A bronze vessel or carved ivory does not have the same meaning in every place. What matters is how a community uses it. Over time, repeated exchange changes both sides. Local craftspeople imitate foreign forms, then alter them. Phoenician settlers adopt foods and practices from neighbors. Children grow up speaking more than one language. Marriages link families. A cemetery contains objects whose origins lie on several shores. This is the expansion hidden beneath the simple arrows on a map. Not conquest rolling forward in one direction. Contact accumulating until a coast becomes part of a shared world. One of the most consequential foundations lay on the coast of North Africa. Later tradition dated the founding of Carthage to 814 or 813 BCE and wrapped the event in the story of a Tyrian princess, Elissa or Dido, who fled political violence and established a new city. Archaeology confirms that Carthage emerged as a Phoenician settlement in roughly this period, though stories of its founding cannot be read as simple eyewitness history. Over time, the colony grew beyond every other Phoenician foundation in the West. Centuries later, it would command fleets, territories, and an empire of its own. But in the early centuries, Carthage was one node in a much larger network. Farther west lay Gator. Ancient tradition claimed a very early foundation for Gator, but archaeological evidence currently places Phoenician settlement there by the late 9th century BCE, with activity in the wider region developing through the 8th. The location was extraordinary. The settlement sat beyond the Mediterranean itself, on the Atlantic side of the Pillars, near the rich mineral worlds of southern Iberia and the exchange systems associated with Tartessos. Silver mattered. The mountains of Iberia contained metal resources that Eastern markets desired. Phoenician contact changed local production and trade, but it did not mean that foreigners simply arrived and carried away treasure from passive inhabitants. Local elites participated. Technologies circulated. New settlements grew. Objects from the Near East appeared in Iberian graves and sanctuaries. Iberian metals moved outward. People changed one another through the exchange. A ship arriving from Tyre could unload oil, wine, fine wares, ornaments, textiles, or crafted goods and take on metals destined for workshops and courts thousands of kilometers away. It might not return directly. A cargo could be broken apart and traded from port to port. One merchant might never see the forest or mine that produced what he sold. A piece of silver could pass through several hands before reaching a palace. A piece of amber could travel south through many communities before entering a Phoenician workshop. The network was powerful precisely because it did not require every journey to connect the endpoints. This is why the old image of Phoenician ships sailing directly to Cornwall for tin must be treated carefully. Tin from Atlantic Europe did enter long-distance exchange systems, and Britain was an important source in antiquity. Yet direct Phoenician voyages to Cornwall are not securely demonstrated by archaeology. The truth is more interesting than the legend. Metals could travel immense distances without the same sailors carrying them all the way. Commerce was a chain, not a single heroic line. The same principle applied eastward. Arabian goods moved toward the Levant through inland and maritime routes. Egyptian products moved north. Cypriot copper circulated widely. Phoenician merchants stood at intersections where goods, techniques, stories, and people changed direction. To make such a system work, sailors needed more than courage. They needed ships. Phoenician vessels appear in Assyrian art and are described indirectly by Greek authors. Merchant ships were broader and deeper than war galleys, built to carry cargo rather than win a sprint. Some depictions show distinctive horse head ornaments at bow or stern, giving rise to the name Hippoi in later descriptions. Warships were longer, narrower, and powered by banks of oars as well as sail. The Phoenicians did not invent seafaring, but they became famous for doing it well. Construction depended on timber selection, joinery, caulking, rope, sailcloth, anchors, and constant maintenance. A ship was not a permanent object. Salt entered seams. Wood worked. Ropes frayed. Hulls collected marine growth. Every voyage consumed part of the vessel carrying it. Navigation consumed attention. Most ancient sailing stayed close enough to known coastlines or island chains that landmarks mattered, but open water crossings were unavoidable. Mariners observed winds, currents, birds, the rising and setting of stars, and the position of constellations. Greek writers later associated Phoenician sailors particularly with the use of the little bear, Ursa Minor, as a guide in northern skies. Whether every captain followed the same system is impossible to know, but the reputation itself tells us something. Other Mediterranean peoples thought of Phoenicians as men who knew how to find their way. At night, the sea removes familiar scale. A mountain seen by day is gone. A coastline becomes a black line and then disappears. The ship creaks. Water knocks against the hull. A helmsman cannot see tomorrow's harbor. He sees a star and trusts a body of knowledge carried through generations. That knowledge could not remove danger. Mediterranean weather changes quickly. A summer sea can become violent. Winter sailing was reduced because storms became more frequent and daylight shorter. Pirates were not a separate category of human being wearing a permanent label. A community that traded in one season might raid in another. Rival cities could seize cargoes. Crews could mutiny. A damaged rudder or torn sail far from a friendly coast could turn profit into disaster. And even a successful voyage could fail commercially. Silver bought too dearly in Iberia might sell poorly in the East. Purple cloth might arrive after a court had already purchased what it needed. A harbor might be closed by war. An imperial tax might rise. A merchant who had borrowed to finance a cargo could return alive and still be ruined. The Phoenician world was therefore built from risk repeated until it became routine. Routine made these voyages possible, but routine never made them safe. Imagine a crossing from Sardinia toward the Balearic waters or southern Iberia late in the sailing season. The morning begins clear. Wind fills the sail from a useful direction. The merchant is pleased because every day saved reduces food consumed aboard. The captain permits himself to think about reaching the next harbor before dark the following day. By afternoon, the wind changes. Not dramatically at first. The sail begins to behave differently. The helmsman compensates. Clouds thicken along a horizon that had been empty. Men who know the sea stop talking about arrival time. Cargo must be secured. A heavy amphora that shifts can smash another. An ingot that moves at the wrong moment can injure a man or alter balance. Sail area is reduced. Lines are checked again. Anything loose becomes dangerous. Then the first hard gust arrives. The romantic image of ancient navigation disappears quickly in bad weather. There is no polished wooden deck beneath calm stars. There is spray in the eyes, wet rope cutting hands, shouted instructions half lost in wind, and a hull whose movement makes simple tasks exhausting. A sailor vomiting over the side must still work. Darkness does not stop the storm because men would prefer to see. The captain's knowledge becomes visible precisely when certainty disappears. Does he turn toward a coast that offers shelter but also reefs? Does he remain offshore and accept heavier sea? Can he trust the anchor if the wind strengthens? How much sail can the mast survive? No rule solves every answer. Experience is a library without pages. If the vessel survives, the story may be told in harbor as evidence that the gods protected them or that the captain acted wisely. If it sinks, later generations may recover cargo and know nothing of the decision that killed or saved the crew. Storms were not the only uncertainty. A sail appears on the horizon. At first, it is simply another ship. That is enough to create tension. A merchant captain cannot immediately know whether the approaching vessel carries traders, officials, soldiers, pirates, or men who might become one of those things depending on opportunity. Ancient maritime categories were fluid. States authorized raiding. Rival communities seized cargo. War changed rules without informing every captain at sea. The crew measures distance. A broad merchant hull loaded with metal is not built to outrun a light warship. Weapons aboard may deter a small threat, but commerce survives best by avoiding combat. Perhaps the other vessel turns away. Perhaps it approaches and proves friendly. Perhaps men who could have killed one another instead exchange news. That is another feature of the sea. Danger and information arrive in the same shape. Harbors therefore mattered as more than convenient gaps in the coast. A trusted harbor meant walls, water, food, repair, interpreters, warehouses, religious protection, and information. It meant a captain could sleep more deeply than he did at anchor off an unknown beach. It meant cargo could be broken down and sold in smaller lots. It meant damaged planks could be replaced. It meant sick crewmen might recover on land. The network was made of safe pauses as much as daring movement. At a Western Phoenician settlement, evening could bring together people who had arrived by entirely different routes. A Tyrian merchant hears a local Iberian trader describe conditions inland. A sailor from Carthage brings news from North Africa. Someone recently arrived from Sicily reports Greek activity. A craftsman wants raw ivory. Another trader is looking for tin. A temple official knows which ship departed 3 days earlier and with whom. News is compared. Rumors are corrected. Prices are adjusted before the next morning. This is how a commercial map updates itself without newspapers, telegraphs, or centralized exchanges. Human memory does the work. Writing helps at the edges. A mark on a jar identifies ownership. A short inscription names a person or deity. A record preserves an obligation. A seal confirms authority. Most of the detailed business paperwork that must once have existed was written on materials that did not survive the Mediterranean climate: papyrus, leather, wax, and would vanish far more easily than stone, pottery, metal, or ivory. So archaeology gives us a strange imbalance. We possess royal inscriptions designed to last. We possess funerary texts designed to remain with the dead. We possess scratches on pottery because fired clay survives by accident. But the invoice that mattered to a merchant for 3 months and then was discarded may be gone forever. The silence should not be mistaken for absence of administration. A trading system stretching thousands of kilometers could not function without counting, measuring, remembering, and checking. Weights mattered. Measures mattered. Names mattered. Trust mattered. And when trust failed, writing became more important. A merchant might not need to write a long narrative about the voyage. He needed to know who owed what to whom. This practical world is one reason the alphabet belongs so naturally in a Phoenician story. The signs were compact enough to move with ordinary transactions. They could be learned and adapted without requiring the vast scribal tradition associated with cuneiform or Egyptian monumental writing. That does not mean every sailor could read. It does not mean literacy suddenly became universal. Ancient literacy remained uneven, and specialists still mattered. But the barrier between spoken language and written record could be crossed with a relatively small inventory of signs. On a coast full of merchants, craftsmen, shipowners, temple officials, and colonial communities, that was useful. The sea rewarded useful things by carrying them farther, and sometimes it carried them to the bottom. One ship, at least, allows us to see what that risk looked like after the sailors themselves disappeared. Off the southeastern coast of Spain, near a submerged rocky outcrop called Bajo de la Campana, archaeologists have investigated the remains of a Phoenician wreck from the late 7th century BCE. The ship did not make it home. We do not know the weather that destroyed it. Perhaps the captain misjudged the rock. Perhaps a storm drove the vessel toward danger faster than the crew could respond. Perhaps the sea was calm until the moment it was not. The event that mattered most to the men aboard is precisely the part archaeology cannot recover. What the seabed preserved was the cargo, and the cargo looks almost like the Phoenician world compressed into one accident. There were raw materials and finished goods. There were objects connected to Iberia and objects whose origins reached much farther. More than 50 elephant tusks are known from the wreck area, some carrying Phoenician inscriptions. There was amber whose ultimate source lay in the Baltic region, far to the north of any Phoenician colony. There were metal objects and materials associated with exchange. Archaeologists found balance weights of the kind merchants used to turn metal and merchandise into agreed quantities. A small stone altar was recovered as well. If it belonged to the vessel, it suggests that sacred practice traveled with the crew in a very literal way. A ship could carry the means to ask divine protection while also carrying the goods from which profit would be made. The altar survived. The ship did not. That contrast is difficult to ignore. The inscriptions on some ivory tusks are even more intimate. A few signs cut into a valuable object bring us closer to an individual act than a long description of international trade. Someone marked a name or dedication. Someone expected the object to be recognized. Someone had a reason for making those particular lines in that particular surface. Then the sea closed over it. For more than 2,000 years the cargo lay where the voyage ended. The wreck is useful because it corrects the clean diagrams we draw in books. Trade maps show arrows passing confidently from east to west. The actual route contains submerged rock, damaged hulls, men working desperately at ropes, cargo shifting in a hold, and decisions made with no guarantee that any archaeologist would later call the voyage part of a great commercial system. The ship also proves how misleading it is to imagine every commodity moving from one origin to one destination in a straight line. Baltic amber could reach a Phoenician vessel near Spain without a Tyrian captain ever sailing into the Baltic Sea. Ivory could move through networks linking Africa to Mediterranean traders. Iberian materials could be loaded beside goods produced elsewhere. A merchant vessel was not a national container carrying only products from its homeland. It was a moving market. The people aboard were living inside the network we reconstruct from the wreckage. Perhaps one sailor had joined in a Western settlement rather than Tyre. Perhaps another had family in Carthage. Perhaps a merchant spoke enough of a local Iberian language to negotiate without an interpreter. Perhaps some men were enslaved laborers whose names would never have appeared on a dedication. We cannot know the crew list. We can know that lowering a heavy anchor required strength, that sails could demand several men working together, that cargo had to be secured before bad weather, and that long voyages were physically demanding even on successful days. The romance of ancient navigation disappears quickly when a sail must be raised in a hard wind. Rope cuts hands. Wet decks become dangerous. A jar that breaks can injure a foot and destroy profit at the same time. Fresh water has weight. Food takes space. Vermin find grain. Salt corrodes metal and stiffens cloth. Men become sick. Tempers shorten when a contrary wind keeps the ship inside the same harbor for a week. The wreck at Bajo de la Campana gives us no final speech from its captain. It gives us something more honest. A journey stopped in the middle. The Phoenician network was not built only by the ships that arrived. It was built in spite of the ships that did not. The great ports were not populated only by kings and merchants whose names reached inscriptions. A harbor depended on people history rarely names. Dockworkers unloaded jars and timber. Rope makers twisted fibers into lines strong enough to hold a sail under pressure. Carpenters replaced damaged planks. Sailmakers repaired cloth. Fishermen sold fresh catch to crews preparing to depart. Potters made transport jars whose shapes became familiar across entire regions. Metal workers repaired tools, anchors, fittings, weapons, and scales. Water carriers moved constantly between wells, cisterns, ships, workshops, and houses. Women are much less visible in surviving political sources, but they were part of the economy that made every voyage possible. They worked in households, textile production, food preparation, religious institutions, family businesses, and craft environments that are difficult to reconstruct precisely because ancient writers so rarely thought their labor worth describing. Elite women could appear in dynastic marriages and dedications. Ordinary women disappear more easily behind the goods their labor helped produce. Children grew up within this soundscape. A child in Tyre could hear several languages in a market before understanding why they were different. Sailors arriving from Cyprus might bring a style of pottery unfamiliar to the previous generation. An Egyptian object could sit in a temple. A Greek trader might mispronounce a local name. A craftsman could copy a foreign image without knowing the story that first gave it meaning. This is how cosmopolitan life begins, not as an ideology, but as repetition. The stranger comes back next season. His coins or weights become recognizable. His god acquires a local equivalent. His son speaks the language better than he does. A port remembers. The ships themselves also required a hidden army of labor before they touched water. Timber had to be seasoned and shaped. Planks were joined with techniques developed through long experience. Internal frames strengthened hulls. Seams were sealed. Masts demanded straight timber and careful balance. Sails required large quantities of woven material. Rope was consumed in extraordinary amounts because every stay, sheet, halyard, anchor line, and mooring depended on it. A merchant ship represented concentrated wealth before any cargo entered the hold. That made shipwreck more than personal tragedy. It could destroy a business partnership, remove experienced sailors from a community, leave debts unpaid, and reduce the number of hulls available for the next trading season. The sea selected for institutions that could survive loss. One vessel might disappear. The route had to continue. One captain might die. Knowledge had to be passed to another. One merchant might fail. Other investors had to keep goods moving. This resilience helps explain why Phoenician commerce could continue even when kings changed and empires arrived. The network was larger than any single ship or ruler. The network was larger than any single ship or ruler, and it was larger than the merchants whose names occasionally survive. A harbor lived because thousands of ordinary tasks happened on time. Before dawn, fishermen could already be returning. Porters waited for cargo. Bakers prepared food for households and crews. Shipwrights listened to the sound of tools against wood. Potters supplied containers without which wine, oil, salted fish, resin, and other goods could not travel efficiently. Rope makers twisted fiber into lengths that would spend their lives under tension. Textile workers produced sailcloth and clothing, as well as the fine fabrics that entered elite trade. The famous merchant stood at the visible edge of an enormous labor system. Someone harvested the flax. Someone spun thread. Someone carried timber downhill. Someone gathered shellfish for dye. Someone cleaned the refuse from workshops after the finished purple cloth had left for a palace. Someone repaired the quay. Someone loaded the jar whose owner would later boast of reaching Spain. Most of these people are nearly invisible in surviving texts. That invisibility should not be confused with insignificance. A city built around trade could not survive on captains alone. It required farmers in the limited coastal hinterland, shepherds in upland zones, craftspeople, domestic workers, servants, enslaved people, temple personnel, guards, scribes, sailors, brokers, and families whose labor kept households functioning while men were away for months. The exact social structure varied from city to city and century to century, and the evidence is fragmentary. We should not pretend to possess a census of ancient Tyre, but the material remains force us to imagine more than wealthy male traders standing beside ships. Think of a household on the island. A ship has been gone since spring. Its absence is an economic fact inside the home. If the merchant returns, there may be profit, gifts, news, and new obligations. If he does not, debts may remain while the person who understood them is gone. Property must be managed. Children must be fed. Contracts may be disputed. Relatives may step forward helpfully or opportunistically. A voyage that appears adventurous from a distance can feel like suspended uncertainty to the people left behind. The sea creates wealth by separating families. Every departure contains a possible funeral without a body. Religious life gave form to that uncertainty. A family could dedicate offerings for safe return. Sailors could promise gifts to Melkart or Astarte after surviving danger. Temples tied private fear to public ritual. The gods of a maritime city were asked to care about wind, fertility, kingship, illness, commerce, and war because ancient life did not separate these categories cleanly. When a ship finally appeared on the horizon, recognition happened in stages. First a sail, then the shape of the hull, then perhaps a painted feature, rigging pattern, or flag known to people on shore. A child might run toward the harbor before an adult was willing to believe it. Men on the quay shouted questions before ropes were secure. Who returned? Who did not? What happened in Sicily? Did the silver sell? Is Carthage safe? Has anyone seen the ship of a cousin who left 2 months earlier? The unloading of cargo was therefore also the unloading of anxiety. A jar could be counted later. A familiar face could not. This human rhythm, departure, waiting, return, repeated for centuries until long-distance seafaring became part of the social calendar of coastal life. It shaped marriages, inheritance, childhood, religious promises, and the way people imagined distance. Children growing up in Tyre could know places they had never seen because adults spoke their names constantly. Cyprus was where an uncle traded. Carthage was where a branch of the family lived. Gator was where silver came from. Egypt was where cedar had gone for generations. Assyria was where tribute disappeared. Geography entered family conversation. That may be one of the quietest consequences of a connected world. The horizon becomes populated by people you know. And once distance becomes part of ordinary life, memory has to become more reliable. Who owns what? Who owes whom? Which cargo belongs to a partner who is still in Cyprus? Which jar is promised to a temple? Which son inherits a share if a ship does not return? And risk creates a need for memory. Who owns the jars? How much silver was weighed? Which merchant advanced goods? Which temple received an offering? Which king granted a privilege? Which name belongs to which man? For answers like these, writing matters. And here we reach the most famous Phoenician legacy, but not in the form the old story usually tells it. The Phoenicians did not invent alphabetic writing from nothing. Centuries before the classical Phoenician cities reached their height, speakers of West Semitic languages had already begun experimenting with a radically reduced set of signs. Early alphabetic inscriptions from places such as Sinai and Wadi el-Hol in Egypt belong to the 2nd millennium BCE. Their creators appear to have adapted ideas from Egyptian signs, using pictures according to the sounds of words in a Semitic language. An ox head could stand for the first sound of a word for ox. A house could stand for the first sound of a word for house. Over centuries, the pictures became more abstract. Regional scripts developed. By around the 11th century BCE, Phoenician inscriptions show a standardized consonantal alphabet of 22 signs written from right to left. This was not the birth of the idea. It was one of the decisive stages in making the idea portable. A Phoenician scribe did not need hundreds of cuneiform signs to record Phoenician speech. The script represented consonants. Readers supplied vowels from language and context. It was compact, flexible, and well-suited to writing names, dedications, ownership marks, contracts, and longer texts. It is tempting to say that this immediately democratized literacy, but that too goes beyond the evidence. Ancient societies could possess simple scripts and still have limited literacy. Writing materials cost money. Education took time. Administrations and temples still employed specialists. We do not know what percentage of ordinary Phoenicians could read a commercial text, but the reduced sign system made writing easier to learn and easier to adapt than the great scribal systems that required far larger repertoires. Most importantly, Phoenician merchants carried it. An inscription on Sardinia, another in Cyprus, letters on objects in Spain, names scratched in places far from Tyre. The same commercial network that moved metal and cloth also moved signs. Somewhere in the 8th century BCE, Greek speakers encountered forms of this writing and transformed them for their own language. Greek tradition itself remembered the connection, calling letters Phoenician in origin. The adaptation was brilliant. Signs representing consonants not needed in Greek were repurposed to write vowels. The resulting Greek alphabet would later influence Etruscan writing in Italy, and from those developments came the Latin alphabet used for English, Spanish, French, and many other languages today. Greek also stands behind the later Cyrillic tradition used for Russian and other languages. Other branches of the early West Semitic alphabetic family developed through Aramaic and related scripts toward Hebrew, Nabatean, and Arabic traditions. The family tree is complicated. Not every alphabetic script on Earth can simply be called a direct Phoenician invention, and the origins of some writing traditions remain debated. But the historical importance of Phoenician transmission is enormous. They did not invent the first alphabet alone. They helped give the alphabet a C, and once letters began moving from harbor to harbor, they became difficult to contain. By the time Greek communities were adopting and reshaping those letters, Phoenician ships were already familiar sights across the Mediterranean. To follow one of them east from Iberia is to pass through a world they had helped stitch together. The ship leaving Gator would first have to return through the Pillars. The Atlantic swell narrows into a strait where wind, current, and geography combine in ways that can challenge even experienced crews. Gibraltar rises to the north. The mountains of North Africa stand to the south. In later mythology, the rocks became the limits opened by Heracles. For sailors, they were not mythic decoration. They were a gateway through which a vessel had to pass safely before the long eastern journey could truly begin. Once inside the Mediterranean, the captain could follow the North African coast or aim toward familiar island routes. Phoenician settlements created a chain of refuge. A harbor meant more than trade. It meant water, repairs, interpreters, information about political conditions farther ahead, and the possibility of finding someone who worshipped familiar gods. At many of these ports, Melkart would have been known. His name means, roughly, king of the city, and he was the great god of Tyre. When Tyrians founded communities abroad, his cult traveled with them. A sanctuary of Melkart stood at Gator and remained famous for centuries. Greek visitors later identified him with Heracles, not because the two gods were originally identical, but because ancient religions often made connections between foreign deities who seemed to share attributes or stories. This is how the Phoenician network carried religion as well as goods. A sailor leaving Tyre did not leave his divine world behind. Astarte, Baal, Melkart, Eshmun, and other deities traveled through dedications, temples, personal names, festivals, and ritual habits. The forms changed from city to city. Local gods met imported gods. Greek, Egyptian, Levantine, and later Roman identifications accumulated. Religion also entered commerce directly. Temples could hold wealth, guarantee oaths, receive dedications after dangerous voyages, and mark spaces where strangers knew which rules applied. A merchant who survived a storm might promise an offering. A ruler celebrating a successful expedition might dedicate captured wealth. The line between business, diplomacy, and sacred obligation was not one ancient people would have recognized as sharply as we do. The Western Phoenician world also developed practices that remain among the most difficult and contested parts of its history. At Carthage and several other Punic sites, archaeologists have excavated areas conventionally called tophets, containing urns with cremated remains of infants, young children, and sometimes animals, accompanied by dedicatory monuments. Greek and Roman authors accused Carthaginians of sacrificing children. Modern scholars have debated how much of the archaeological record represents sacrifice, how much may represent special burial of children who died naturally, and whether practices varied across time and place. Some researchers argue strongly that ritual sacrifice occurred. Others caution that the evidence does not support making every burial a sacrifice. The uncertainty matters. Carthage was a Phoenician foundation, but Punic religion in the Western Mediterranean developed over centuries and cannot simply be projected unchanged back onto every city of the Levant. A bedtime history does not become more accurate by turning a difficult argument into a lurid certainty. What survives tells us that ritual, death, family, and vows to the gods were bound together in ways modern observers find hard to reconstruct. Our imagined ship would encounter Carthage not as an archaeological debate, but as a living harbor. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the city was growing rapidly. Its position on the North African coast gave access to routes east and west, to fertile lands inland, and to the central Mediterranean. Quays, workshops, warehouses, shrines, houses, and markets expanded. Ships came from Phoenician settlements in Sardinia and Sicily, from Iberia, and from the Levant. Local North African communities were part of the economic world around the city. Carthage was becoming less a daughter waiting on Tyre and more a power capable of organizing Western networks around itself. That shift would matter later. As Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and finally Macedon changed the political fate of the Levantine homeland. Carthage preserved a Western Punic world for centuries. The culture did not remain identical to Tyre. Languages evolve, institutions change, new populations join, but the link was remembered. Carthaginians called themselves in ways connected to Canaanite ancestry, worshipped gods of Levantine origin, and wrote a language closely descended from Phoenician. A merchant sailing east from Carthage might next pass Sicily. Here the map became crowded. Phoenicians established themselves especially in the west of the island, at sites such as Motia, Panormus, and Saguntum. Greeks founded colonies elsewhere. Indigenous Sicilian peoples remained part of the landscape. The island became a place where commercial competition could turn into war and where cultural boundaries remained permeable even when fleets fought. Motia occupied a small island in a lagoon on Sicily's western coast. Its protected position was useful for ships and easy to defend until an enemy learned how to overcome the water. Workshops, houses, fortifications, sanctuaries, and imported goods reveal a community tied to the wider Phoenician world but embedded in Sicily. Centuries later, Greek forces under Dionysius of Syracuse would destroy the city after a hard siege. By then, Carthage rather than Tyre had become the great western protector of Punic interests. Sardinia offered metals and strategic harbors. Phoenician settlements appeared along its coasts, including Sulcis and Theros. The famous Nora stone, found on the island, preserves one of the earliest Phoenician inscriptions from the western Mediterranean. Its text remains difficult to interpret, but its very presence says something remarkable. A script standardized in the Levant had crossed the sea and been cut into stone on an island near the center of the western Mediterranean. Letters were becoming geography. The farther east the ship traveled, the more the network thickened. Malta occupied a useful position between Sicily and North Africa. Cyprus linked the Mediterranean to the Levant and offered copper. The Aegean brought contact with Greek communities that were themselves expanding overseas. Ports could contain Greeks, Phoenicians, Cypriots, Egyptians, Arameans, Anatolians, and others whose identities mattered but did not prevent exchange. A harbor is a machine for producing encounters. Someone needs water. Someone needs rope. Someone wants metal. Someone knows where grain is cheaper. Someone has heard that a king has died. Someone can translate a contract. Someone recognizes a god beneath a foreign name. Someone brings news of a storm that destroyed 3 ships off a cape. Someone carries a song. Not every encounter is peaceful, but even conflict can transmit information. This interconnected world made the Phoenicians visible to Greek poets. In Homeric poetry, Phoenicians appear as skilled craftsmen and traders, but also, at times, as tricksters or kidnappers. The portraits are stereotypes, not ethnography. They reveal admiration mixed with suspicion. A stranger arriving by ship could bring precious objects or deception. The merchant who knows distant prices possesses knowledge others do not, and knowledge can look like cunning to those who lack it. Phoenicians probably told similar stories about Greeks, but almost none of their literature survives. This is one of the great distortions in how we know them. We possess Phoenician inscriptions, royal dedications, funerary texts, names, coins, objects, and archaeological remains. We possess fragments of traditions quoted by later writers. But we do not possess a Phoenician Herodotus telling us how Tyre understood Assyria, or a Phoenician poet describing a storm west of Sardinia, or a merchant's memoir of the first time he saw Iberian silver mines. Their neighbors speak louder because their books survived. The Hebrew Bible mentions Tyre, Sidon, Baal, Astarte, cedar, craftsmen, traders, alliances, and religious rivalry. Assyrian kings boast about tribute and punishment. Greek writers describe merchants, voyages, colonies, and customs. Roman authors later look backward at Carthage through the memory of war. Every source has a position. A king's inscription is not a neutral newspaper. If an Assyrian ruler says he terrified the coast, the purpose is to display power. If a biblical prophet condemns Tyre's wealth, the text is making a moral and theological argument. If a Greek author tells a story about a cunning Phoenician, the story may reveal Greek anxieties as much as Phoenician practice. The civilization that connected others is known to us largely through the voices of those others. That makes the material remains unusually important. A shipwreck can say what a poem does not. Amphories show what moved. Isotopes can reveal where metal originated. Pottery styles show contact. Inscriptions prove that people carrying Phoenician language and script were present far from home. Animal bones reveal diet. Harbor structures reveal engineering. Murex shell heaps reveal industry. Tombs show how objects from several cultures could belong to one burial. Even so, archaeology rarely gives us a captain's thought when the wind shifted. For that, we return to reconstruction. Our ship leaves the western islands behind and continues east. The voyage is long enough that seasons matter. A merchant cannot simply sail whenever profit calls. Ancient Mediterranean navigation had a sailing season shaped by weather and daylight. Voyages outside the safer months occurred, but risk increased. Captains might wait in harbor for days while wind blew from the wrong direction. A delay could consume food and profit. News grew old. Another trader could reach the market first. At each stop, the crew might encounter different standards of weight and value. Coinage did not become common everywhere at once. Much trade relied on weighed metal, established measures, barter, credit, and relationships built over repeated dealings. Trust was a form of infrastructure. A merchant who cheated once might profit once. A merchant who wanted to return next year needed a reputation. Family firms and partnerships could extend across ports. Temples and palaces could participate in trade. Kings could commission expeditions or tax them. Private and public activity overlapped. We should be cautious about imagining modern banks and insurance companies in ancient Tyre, but long-distance commerce required ways to distribute risk, record obligations, and enforce agreements. Writing helped, but so did memory and relationship. The alphabet did not create the network by itself. The network gave the alphabet reasons to travel. There is another reason Phoenician letters spread so effectively. They were attached to no universal claim that everyone had to become Phoenician first. The surviving inscriptions let us glimpse the kinds of situations in which those letters lived. A royal inscription speaks in the voice of power. A dedication speaks to a god. A funerary inscription protects memory. A short mark on a vessel may simply identify a person. None of these forms looks revolutionary while it is being written. That is important. The alphabet did not conquer the Mediterranean because people recognized that they were witnessing one of the great intellectual turning points of history. It spread because individuals found it useful in specific places. A merchant needs a name recorded. A craftsman marks an object. A ruler wants his building remembered. A family wants a grave protected from disturbance. A sanctuary receives an offering from someone who wants both God and community to know who gave it. Use accumulates before significance becomes visible. The letter shapes themselves carried older histories. Early alphabetic writing had developed centuries before the classical Phoenician script, probably through experiments in which speakers of a Semitic language adapted signs ultimately related to Egyptian hieroglyphic forms. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the Phoenician system had become stable enough that inscriptions from different places can be recognized as belonging to the same script tradition. 22 consonantal signs were written from right to left. A Phoenician reader supplied vowels from knowledge of the language. For Phoenician, that worked. Then the signs encountered Greek. Greek speech required different solutions. Some Phoenician consonantal signs represented sounds Greek, did not need. Greek users repurposed several of them to represent vowels. This adaptation was not merely copying. It was redesign. Aleph, originally connected to a consonantal sound, became alpha. Beth became beta. Gimel became gamma. Daleth became delta. The order remained recognizable even as sounds and shapes changed. The people making these changes probably did not imagine Latin books, Cyrillic manuscripts, printed newspapers, or digital keyboards. They were solving immediate linguistic problems. The transformation may have happened through repeated contacts rather than one single moment of invention. Different Greek regions developed local alphabetic variants. The exact place and path of transmission remain debated because useful ideas rarely leave us a signed certificate explaining where the handoff occurred. Ports are good places for such uncertainty. Imagine a mixed settlement or trading harbor where Phoenician and Greek speakers meet often enough that curiosity becomes familiarity. At first, the signs belong to someone else's language. A merchant sees them on containers. A sailor recognizes a few names. A local craftsman copies a mark without understanding every sound. Then someone asks how the system works. Not what the inscription means, how it works. That is the dangerous question for any technology of information, because once the principle is understood, ownership becomes difficult. The answer is astonishingly portable. This sign stands for a sound, then another, then another. A small set of signs can be recombined to write words no one has written before. A trader does not need permission from Tyre to use the idea. A Greek community does not need to worship Melkart to adapt the letters. The system can detach from the civilization that carried it. That detachment is why it survives. Other Phoenician exports remain tied to resources or specialized knowledge. Purple dye depended on shellfish, workshops, recipes, labor, and access to production. Cedar depended on forests. A harbor depended on geography. A ship depended on craftsmen and timber. The alphabet could be rebuilt almost anywhere once someone knew the principle. A teacher, a scratch on pottery, a dedication, a merchant's mark, any of these could carry it onward. The earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions that survive are not grand state archives announcing a literacy revolution. Some are brief, playful, personal, or associated with objects. Writing enters social life in fragments. Then it expands. Poetry can be recorded. Laws can be displayed. Names can be fixed in stone. Communities can argue over words that remain after the speaker is gone. None of these developments belongs to Phoenicians alone. Greek societies made their own choices. Later Etruscans, Romans, Aramaic scribes, Jewish communities, Nabateans, Arabs, and many others transformed related writing traditions according to their own languages and institutions. But the maritime network created conditions in which one useful script tradition crossed boundaries repeatedly. The letters traveled like cargo that became more valuable every time someone opened the container and changed what was inside. The same was true of artistic styles. Phoenician craftsmen borrowed Egyptian motifs and remade them. A winged sphinx, a lotus, a falcon, a sacred tree, or a royal image might appear in a Levantine object without meaning exactly what it had meant in Egypt or Assyria. When that object traveled to Italy or Iberia, another audience could reinterpret it again. The Mediterranean did not become connected because everyone became the same. It became connected because difference became transportable. By the 6th century BCE, the Phoenician cities of the Levant had survived Assyrian pressure only to enter a new age of imperial domination. The Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed at the end of the 7th century BCE. Babylonian power replaced it in much of the region. Nebuchadnezzar II campaigned along the Levantine coast and subjected Phoenician cities. A later tradition preserves the memory of a long siege of Tyre, perhaps lasting 13 years. The precise outcome and details are difficult to reconstruct, But the problem Tyre presented was obvious. The old city occupied an island just offshore. An army could devastate the mainland and still face water. Walls rose from the island edge. Ships could bring supplies or challenge attackers. Siege engines designed for land had to be adapted. Tyre's geography made it a commercial advantage in peace and a defensive weapon in war. But no city could live outside the politics of its region forever. When the Persian Achaemenid Empire conquered Babylon in the 6th century BCE and extended its authority westward, the Phoenician cities became part of the largest imperial system their world had yet seen. Under Persian rule, their maritime skill was more valuable than ever. The Achaemenid kings possessed enormous land armies, but controlling the eastern Mediterranean required fleets. Phoenician contingents became a central part of Persian naval power, alongside Cypriot, Egyptian, and Ionian forces. The ships of cities that had once negotiated with Assyria now served kings ruling from far beyond Mesopotamia. This produced one of the great ironies of Phoenician history. The people remembered above all as traders also became indispensable to imperial war at sea. When Persia fought Greek states in the early 5th century BCE, Phoenician ships stood in the fleets of the great king. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, men from Phoenician cities fought against Greek fleets in the narrow waters near Athens. From a later Greek perspective, this placed them on the side of the invading empire. From Tyre or Sidon, the choice belonged to a different political reality. Their cities were imperial subjects and naval service was part of that relationship. Commerce did not free them from empire. It made empire want their ships. Yet Persian rule could also create opportunities. The empire stabilized vast routes from the Mediterranean deep into Asia. Phoenician cities minted coins, traded, built, and preserved local institutions. Sidon became especially prominent for a period. Its kings displayed wealth in elaborate sarcophagi and inscriptions. A Phoenician city could be both subordinate to Persia and powerful within the imperial system. That balance could break. In the 4th century BCE, Sidon participated in rebellion against Persian authority. Artaxerxes III responded with overwhelming force. Ancient accounts describe catastrophe in the city, though the dramatic numbers and details given by later sources require caution. The episode revealed the old limit once again. Maritime wealth and strong walls could not guarantee independence against a great empire determined to punish revolt. Still, the ships sailed. The naval service demanded by Persia also changed how outsiders saw them. A Greek watching a Phoenician squadron approach during the Persian Wars did not see neutral merchants carrying purple cloth. He saw enemy ships. That perspective left a deep mark on surviving literature because so much of what we know about the Mediterranean in this period comes through Greek authors. The same people could appear as skilled navigators, dangerous rivals, clever merchants, useful craftsmen, or servants of the great king, depending on the story being told. Reality was less tidy. A Phoenician captain in Persian service might spend one season transporting troops and another participating in trade. A city obligated to provide warships still contained private merchants whose profits depended on Greek customers. War did not erase the economic geography beneath it. Even during periods of conflict, goods continued moving where they could. This is easy to forget because battles create clear dates and commerce usually does not. A battle happens on one day. A route is maintained through thousands of ordinary days. The Phoenician reputation for seamanship was reinforced by imperial service. Large fleets required coordination beyond the needs of private commerce. Crews had to maneuver together, respond to signals, maintain formation, embark troops, carry supplies, and operate across distances controlled by royal strategy rather than merchant profit. Phoenician cities possessed generations of experience that made them valuable to kings who ruled enormous land empires but needed mastery at sea. That value, however, was never the same as independence. A king can admire your skill and still command it. This tension runs through Phoenician history from Egypt to Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and finally Macedon. Again and again, larger states wanted what the coastal cities knew how to do. Again and again, the cities attempted to preserve as much autonomy as circumstances allowed. Sometimes negotiation worked. Sometimes it failed catastrophically. But before we reach the most famous catastrophe, there is one more voyage to consider, one so extraordinary that even Herodotus did not quite believe the detail that makes modern readers pause. Around 600 BCE, according to Herodotus, the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II commissioned Phoenician mariners to leave the Red Sea, sail around Africa, pass through the Pillars of Heracles, and return to Egypt from the Mediterranean. Herodotus wrote the story more than a century later. No Phoenician logbook survives. No Egyptian inscription has been found confirming the expedition. We should therefore resist saying simply that the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa as an established fact. But the account contains a detail that has fascinated readers for centuries. Herodotus says the voyage took 3 years. Each year, the sailors supposedly went ashore when the season required, sowed grain, waited for it to grow, harvested it, and continued. Then he adds something he himself found unbelievable. The sailors claimed that while traveling around part of Africa, they had the sun on their right hand. For a crew sailing westward in the southern hemisphere, the sun can indeed appear to the north, on the right side of the vessel. Herodotus did not understand why that detail might support the story. To him it sounded suspicious. To later readers, that disbelief became the most intriguing part. It does not prove the voyage. A true astronomical detail can enter a false story, and oral traditions can change. But it is difficult not to feel the pull of the possibility. Imagine it if it happened. The eastern Mediterranean disappears behind them. The Red Sea opens south. Familiar coasts become unfamiliar. Languages change. Stars shift. The crew repairs the ship in places no Tyrian merchant house can rescue them. They wait through seasons. They plant grain because stored food cannot last forever. They move south until the sun itself behaves in a way their world did not expect. Then the coast bends. The voyage turns west. Months become years. At last, a crew that departed through one sea returns through another, entering the Mediterranean from the Atlantic and passing the same pillars our imagined merchant ship crossed at the beginning of tonight's story. If Herodotus preserved a real memory, the voyage was one of the most extraordinary achievements of ancient navigation. If he preserved a legend, the legend still tells us what ancient people believed Phoenician sailors might be capable of. Both possibilities reveal reputation. They were the sailors others sent when the edge of the map became a question. Reputation, however, is a dangerous thing to inherit. A city famous for ships and walls can begin to believe that what survived one empire will survive the next. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, the political world around the eastern Mediterranean was changing again. Persia still ruled the Phoenician coast, but Macedon was rising in the north. Philip II created the military machine. His son Alexander turned it east. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia. Persian armies were defeated at the Granicus and then at Issus. The route south along the Levantine coast became essential because Alexander could not safely pursue the Persian king deep inland, while the Achaemenid fleet still possessed bases behind him. He needed the ports. Most Phoenician cities judged resistance hopeless. Sidon received him. Byblos submitted. Arwood came to terms. Tyre did not. The decision was not as simple as a city refusing Macedonian rule. Tyre offered Alexander access to the city, but resisted his demand to sacrifice at the great temple of Melkart on the island. For Alexander, who identified Melkart with Heracles and understood ritual as political theater, Entering the sanctuary would demonstrate sovereignty. For the Tyrians, allowing an armed king inside could mean surrender in everything but name. The island closed its gates. Alexander now faced the problem that had frustrated powerful enemies before him. Between mainland and city lay water. The channel was not vast, but it was enough. Tyrian walls rose high above the sea. The defenders possessed ships, experienced crews, missiles, engineers, and the confidence of a city whose island geography had protected it for centuries. A conventional land siege could not reach them. Alexander changed the geography. His army began building a causeway from the mainland toward the island. Stones, timber, rubble, and earth were thrown into the sea. At first the water was shallow and progressed fast. Then the causeway reached deeper water, where Tyrian ships could attack the workers. Towers were built on the advancing mole. The Tyrians sent fire ships against them. Engines burned. Men drowned. The sea that had always protected Tyre fought for the city again. But Alexander had resources no earlier attacker had combined in quite the same way. As other Phoenician and Cypriot fleets shifted to his side, Tyre lost the naval advantage on which its defense depended. Ships that had once served the Persian Empire now helped Macedon attack a Phoenician city. The network turned against one of the cities that had built it. The siege lasted about 7 months. The siege deserves to slow down here, because it brought centuries of Phoenician experience into one terrifying concentration. Tyre had always trusted the same facts. Water separated it from armies. Walls rose above that water. Ships connected it to supplies and allies. Sailors understood the channel better than attackers. Those facts had survived earlier kings. Alexander attacked each one. At the beginning, his causeway looked almost absurd. An army was trying to turn sea into land. Workers carried stone and rubble from the mainland. Timber strengthened the growing structure. Loads disappeared beneath the water before the surface advanced. Near shore the depth was manageable, and progress gave the Macedonians confidence. From the walls, Tyrians watched the enemy approach one basket and one stone at a time. Then the work entered deeper water. The defenders could reach it more easily. Missiles fell on laborers. Boats attacked exposed sections. Alexander built towers on the advancing mole to protect workers and mount artillery. The Tyrians answered with one of the most dramatic counterattacks described in the ancient siege narratives. They prepared an old transport as a fire ship. Combustible material was loaded aboard. The vessel was weighted and arranged so that flame would be driven into the Macedonian works. Towed toward the end of the causeway and released at the right moment, it struck the siege structures and ignited them. Fire ran through timber. Towers burned. Men who had spent weeks pushing the road toward Tyre watched part of it become an inferno. Tyrian crews attacked amid the confusion. For a moment, the sea had won again. A less determined commander might have reconsidered the entire siege. Alexander widened the causeway. He rebuilt. More importantly, he recognized that Tyre could not be taken while Tyre controlled the water. So the struggle became naval. Here the political isolation of the city became fatal. Phoenician fleets from other cities had already submitted to Alexander or shifted allegiance after the Persian defeat. Cypriot kings also brought ships. The attacker, who began without naval superiority, eventually assembled a fleet far larger than the defenders could comfortably challenge. Tyrian sailors now saw something almost unbearable from the walls. Ships built by peoples who shared their maritime world were closing their harbors on behalf of Macedon. The skills that had made Phoenician cities indispensable to empires were being used against the most famous Phoenician island city. The entrances to the harbors became battlefields of wood and bronze. Tyrians placed vessels to block access. Alexander's ships pressed closer. Siege engines were mounted on ships, so walls could be attacked from the water as well as from the mole. Large stones thrown into the sea beneath the defenses hindered approach. Macedonian crews tried to remove them. Tyrian divers cut anchor cables. Alexander's men responded by using chains where rope could be severed. Each solution produced a counter-solution. This was not brute force alone. It was an engineering argument conducted with men dying inside it. For the people trapped in Tyre, the siege changed ordinary life long before the final breach. Food became a calculation. Water became a calculation. Every damaged ship mattered more than it had a month earlier. Every wounded rower reduced the city's ability to move. Workshops that had produced trade goods now served defense. Timber that might have become a merchant vessel became reinforcement. Metal was turned toward war. Families listened to artillery strike walls that had seemed permanent. Merchants who had spent their lives calculating the risks of storms and distant markets faced a different arithmetic. How many days could the city continue? Religious ritual intensified because war did not separate itself from the gods. Melkart's city was under attack by a conqueror who claimed his own relationship to Heracles, the Greek figure with whom Melkart had long been identified by outsiders. Alexander's desire to sacrifice in the sanctuary had helped create the confrontation. Now theology and sovereignty were inseparable from siege engines. The defenders continued resisting. Ancient accounts emphasize their ingenuity because even hostile narrators understood how difficult Tyre was to reduce. They repaired damage, launched sorties, attacked ships, and used the height of their walls to punish men below. The Macedonians paid for every advance. But the balance had changed. The causeway was no longer a narrow experiment that could be burned once and forgotten. The fleet tightened control. Siege engines battered from several directions. The defenders could no longer assume that the sea behind them remained open. Then a breach appeared. A breach in a wall is not yet a captured city. It is a place where everyone knows the next attack will come. Tyrians concentrated defenders. Macedonian assault troops prepared. Ships carrying boarding bridges and elite soldiers approached the damaged section. Other attacks distracted the defenders elsewhere. The final struggle happened at close range. Men climbed through broken masonry and over bodies. Defenders fought from towers, walls, streets, and harbor edges. Once Macedonian troops secured a foothold, more followed. Other forces entered through the harbors. The geometry that had protected Tyre for centuries collapsed inward. The city was taken. What followed was punishment on a scale ancient conquerors intended to be remembered. Sources describe mass killing, enslavement, and executions. Their exact numbers differ, and ancient totals should be treated cautiously. The essential fact does not depend on a precise figure. The population suffered terribly. Months of resistance had made mercy less likely, not more. From Alexander's perspective, Tyre had delayed a campaign meant to move south toward Egypt and then deeper into the Persian Empire. It had challenged his authority after neighboring cities submitted. Its fall needed to demonstrate that no island wall could permanently stop him. From a Tyrian perspective, the same event was the destruction of households. A father killed on a wall is not a geopolitical lesson to his family. A child sold away from the city does not experience the triumph of Macedonian engineering. A merchant who loses his warehouse does not care that later historians will admire the causeway. The great story and the private catastrophe occupy the same ground. Alexander finally entered the sanctuary and made the sacrifice he had demanded months earlier. The ritual that might once have signaled peaceful submission now took place after conquest. That difference contained the entire tragedy. Tyre had refused to let an armed king demonstrate sovereignty inside its sacred center. The king reached it anyway. Yet the victory produced an unintended monument to Tyrian resistance. The causeway remained. Currents deposited sediment around it. Sand accumulated. The island that armies had struggled to reach gradually became connected permanently to the mainland. Alexander won because he changed the coastline. The coastline remembered. Centuries later, When travelers approached Tyre by land, they crossed a geography created by the siege. The city's greatest defensive advantage had been physically erased, but only because it had resisted strongly enough to force one of antiquity's most relentless conquerors to build a road through the sea. And even then, Phoenician life did not end with the breach. The conquest of 332 BC ended the independent political world in which Phoenician kings had negotiated their own survival between empires. It did not end Phoenician people. Under Alexander's successors, the Eastern Mediterranean became increasingly Hellenistic. Greek became a dominant language of administration and elite culture across large territories. Cities acquired Greek institutions and artistic forms. Local traditions remained. Phoenician names continued. Temples continued. Coins carried changing combinations of local and imperial imagery. Languages overlapped before one slowly retreated. There was no morning on which everyone in Tyre woke up and discovered that Phoenician civilization had disappeared. Cultures rarely end that neatly. A grandfather may speak one language more often than his grandson. A family may preserve an old divine name while writing official business in Greek. A merchant may use different languages with different partners. A city festival can continue under a new dynasty. A script may become less common without anyone deciding that a civilization is over. In the Western Mediterranean, Punic culture remained politically powerful for much longer because Carthage had become independent of the fate of the Levantine cities. Carthaginian ships patrolled western routes. Punic settlements and communities spread through North Africa, Sardinia, western Sicily, and Iberia. Their language descended from Phoenician and continued to be written for centuries. Then Rome grew. The wars between Rome and Carthage would turn the western descendants of Phoenician settlers into Rome's greatest rival. Hannibal, born into a Punic world many centuries after Tyrian colonists first sailed west, still worshipped Melkart. Before beginning the campaign that would carry him across the Alps, tradition places him at the sanctuary of Melkart at Gator, at the far western end of the old Phoenician route. The geography had endured. Tyre to Carthage, Carthage to Iberia, Iberia back toward the central Mediterranean. A chain first built for trade had become the strategic skeleton of wars. When Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, it destroyed a state, not every Punic community. The language survived in North Africa. Centuries later, Augustine of Hippo could still refer to people who spoke Punic. Local traditions persisted under Roman rule long after the political systems that created them were gone. By then, the old Phoenician alphabet had already escaped any possibility of destruction. No army could capture all its descendants. What survived was not only the shape of letters. People survived in places where political labels changed. A family in North Africa could preserve a Punic name while living under Roman law. A farmer could speak Punic at home and encounter Latin in administration. A sanctuary could acquire Roman forms while retaining older local habits. Religious names changed through translation and identification, but older relationships between communities and sacred places did not vanish instantly. This is why the disappearance of the word Phoenician from political history can create the wrong impression. Civilizations rarely leave the stage the way actors do. There is no final bow. A language becomes less common in one city while remaining strong in another. A script disappears from official use but survives in local inscriptions. A god receives a new name from a new ruling culture. A harbor keeps functioning because ships still need shelter regardless of who collects the tax. Even conquest depends on continuity. Alexander needed Phoenician ships after conquering Phoenician cities. Hellenistic kings needed their ports. Rome needed the western harbors that Punic communities had developed. Empires inherit infrastructure from the people they defeat. Roads continue. Harbors continue. Commercial habits continue. Families continue. The conqueror changes the flag above the gate more quickly than he changes the reasons merchants enter it. That continuity also explains why Phoenician influence is difficult to isolate neatly in later Mediterranean culture. Once a technique, motif, route, word, or religious practice has passed through several societies, ownership becomes blurred. A design that began in Egypt may be reworked by a Phoenician craftsman, purchased by an Etruscan elite, copied in Italy, and later identified by modern scholars as part of a Mediterranean style. Who owns it? History often wants clean origins. Trade creates mixtures. The Phoenicians were exceptionally good at creating mixtures because their power came from movement between worlds rather than domination of one enormous territory. That is why their legacy can seem smaller than their influence. An Egyptian pyramid points back to Egypt. A Roman aqueduct announces Rome. A Phoenician route disappears into everyone who used it afterward. Now return to the imagined merchant ship with which we began. After weeks or months of travel from the Atlantic, after waiting out unfavorable wind, trading in western harbors, passing Sicily, perhaps touching Cyprus, and crossing the last eastern waters, the crew sees the Levantine coast. Land appears first as a change in the horizon, then mountains. The same mountains that gave cedar to Egypt and Assyria stand behind the coastal cities. The sailors have crossed a world, but home is narrow, a strip between stone and sea. If the destination is Tyre before Alexander, the island rises ahead, its walls and buildings crowded above the water. Small craft move between shore and harbor. Fishing boats return. Naval vessels lie ready. Merchant hulls wait to unload. The harbor smells of salt, pitch, rope, animals, cooking, refuse, and cargo opened after a long voyage. Silver from Iberia is weighed. Accounts are checked. A merchant argues about quality. A porter shoulders an amphora. Someone asks for news from Carthage. Someone has heard that an Assyrian official is demanding more tribute, or that Babylon has fallen, or that Persian ships are assembling, depending on the century in which we imagine the return. The harbor is never only about what arrived. It is about what information arrived with it. This may have been the Phoenicians' greatest product before the alphabet ever reached Greece. Not one object, but connection itself. A Tyrian craftsman could work ivory from far away using Egyptian-looking motifs for an Assyrian customer. A Greek could encounter Eastern luxury goods through a Phoenician intermediary. An Iberian community could gain new technologies and imported objects while Eastern merchants gained access to metals. A Cypriot harbor could connect copper to Western demand. A North African settlement could grow into Carthage and eventually create its own sphere of power. The network did not make the ancient Mediterranean peaceful. It made it entangled. That difference matters. Connected societies can still hate one another. Trade partners can become enemies. Shared technologies can make war more effective. Phoenician ships served Persians against Greeks. Carthage fought Greeks in Sicily. Rome traded with Carthage before fighting it to destruction. Alexander used Phoenician ships against Tyre. Connection is not harmony. It is dependence, knowledge, imitation, rivalry, and opportunity tied together. The Phoenicians excelled in that world because their cities had spent centuries learning to survive through relationships they could not fully control. Their political weakness helped shape their commercial strength. A great territorial empire can command resources from within its borders. A small coastal city must persuade, exchange, adapt, or submit. Tyre could not grow wheat on the scale of Mesopotamia. It could not field an Assyrian army. It could not order Iberian miners to work from across the sea. It could make itself useful. That usefulness was not always enough to save it, but it kept the city relevant through Egyptian influence, Assyrian expansion, Babylonian pressure, Persian rule, Macedonian conquest, Hellenistic kingdoms, and Rome. There is a quiet lesson in the survival. We often remember ancient civilizations through what refuses to move: pyramids, city walls, temples, stone statues. The Phoenicians are different because so much of what made them important was designed to move. Wood becomes a ship and leaves the forest. Purple becomes cloth and leaves the workshop. Silver leaves Iberia. Ivory leaves Africa. An image leaves Egypt and appears on a Levantine object. A god leaves Tyre and receives a sanctuary at Gator. A letter leaves the Levant and becomes Greek. Movement leaves fewer monuments than stone. That may be one reason the Phoenicians can feel strangely absent from the history they helped create. Egypt has pyramids that rise above the desert. Assyria left palace reliefs showing kings at war. Athens has the ruins of the Acropolis. Rome filled an empire with roads, amphitheaters, aqueducts, and inscriptions in its own name. Phoenician Tyre was repeatedly rebuilt. Ancient harbors changed with sediment and construction. Organic writing materials vanished. Cedar forests were cut, regrown, reduced, and protected. Purple workshops left shell heaps rather than marble declarations of world importance. Merchant ships sank or rotted. Colonies became other cities under other names. Their civilization survives less like a monument and more like a route. You recognize it only after following where things went. The cedar in an Egyptian context. The ivory in an Assyrian palace. The Phoenician inscription in Sardinia. The settlement beneath modern Cadiz. The temple tradition carried into Carthage. The alphabet reshaped in Greece. The Punic words still heard in Roman North Africa. Each piece alone seems local. Together they reveal the sea between them. And the sea is the missing monument. Not because the Phoenicians owned it. No one did. Greeks sailed it. Egyptians sailed it. Cypriots sailed it. Etruscans, Carthaginians, Romans, and countless unnamed fishing communities sailed it. Long before Phoenician expansion, Bronze Age sailors crossed it. Long after Tyre lost independence, merchants continued using routes older than the empires that taxed them. The Phoenician achievement was not to discover an empty Mediterranean. It was to intensify connection across an already ancient maritime world until Eastern cities, Western metals, island harbors, African settlements, and Greek communities belonged to overlapping systems of exchange. That is a less dramatic achievement than conquering the world in 10 years. It is also harder to undo. Alexander could breach Tyre's walls. He could not make Greeks forget their letters. Rome could destroy Carthage. It could not return the Western Mediterranean to the world before Phoenician settlement. Languages could disappear. Connections could survive them. Even the name Phoenician became something later people reconstructed from fragments. Modern inhabitants of Lebanon live among sites associated with Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and other ancient cities, but they are not simply unchanged Phoenicians carried through 3,000 years. The region passed through Hellenistic kingdoms, Rome, Byzantium, Arab conquest, medieval states, Ottoman rule, modern nationalism, migration, and countless social changes. Ancient identity should not be turned into a simple modern bloodline. What survives securely is history in place. At Byblos, layers of settlement show how long the coast looked outward. At Sidon, excavations continue to reveal cemeteries, buildings, and objects from worlds that preceded and followed the Phoenician period. At Tyre, the sea still meets a city whose geography has been changed permanently by Alexander's causeway. In Lebanon's mountains, protected cedar groves preserve a tree whose ancient reputation became part of the country's modern symbol. Off the coast, murex snails still live in Mediterranean waters. And in museums far from the Levant, small inscriptions preserve letters that once belonged to people whose voices we cannot hear. One inscription may contain only a name. A name is enough to remind us that civilizations are never only systems. Behind every route were people waiting. A sailor's family did not experience Mediterranean connectivity as a map with colored arrows. They experienced absence. A ship leaves. Weeks pass. No message can arrive faster than another ship. A storm occurs somewhere beyond Cyprus, and a household in Tyre does not know. A merchant reaches Sardinia but must winter there, and no one at home can distinguish delay from death. A vessel returns unexpectedly early with a broken mast and half its cargo missing. Another never appears. The profits of maritime civilization were purchased with uncertainty. The same is true at the western end. A local Iberian community trading with Phoenician settlers saw strangers arrive whose goods, gods, habits, and technologies could alter local power. Some families benefited. Others may have lost influence. New towns changed older landscapes. Imported luxury objects became signs of status. Foreign craftsmen worked beside local craftsmen. Children grew up in mixed communities where the difference between newcomer and native could become less clear with each generation. History often labels an object Phoenician or Iberian because museums need categories. Life at a port was messier. A pot could imitate an Eastern form using local clay. A person could have a Phoenician name and a local mother. A sanctuary could contain symbols from several traditions. A merchant could speak more than one language badly and still make a deal. The connected ancient world was built by imperfect translation. This is why the Phoenicians matter beyond a list of inventions. If we reduce them to purple, glass, cedar, colonies, and alphabet, we miss the larger pattern those things share. They specialized in crossing boundaries. Forest to sea, east to west, local god to foreign equivalent, picture to letter, raw material to luxury object, trading station to permanent city, subject people to imperial naval specialists, Phoenician colony to independent Carthaginian power. Nothing stayed exactly what it was when it crossed, and that may explain why their own identity became so difficult to isolate later. A civilization devoted to connection leaves pieces of itself everywhere in a smaller, blurrier outline at the center. We can now return one last time to the tiny inscription that may have traveled aboard our imagined ship. Perhaps it marks a merchant's name. Perhaps it records ownership. Perhaps nothing like it was actually on that particular vessel. The reconstruction has served its purpose. The ship itself is now approaching harbor. The sail is lowered. Oars or small craft help guide the vessel where wind is no longer useful. Ropes are thrown. Men on shore pull. The hull touches the familiar movement of protected water after weeks of open sea. Cargo that survived the voyage is unloaded. The silver will not remain silver. It may become a bowl, jewelry, payment, tribute, temple treasure, or another merchant's capital. The information will not remain information. It will become decisions about the next voyage. And the letters will not remain Phoenician. That is the part no one on the quay can know. A scribe making a short mark has no reason to imagine Greek poets, Roman laws, medieval manuscripts, printed books, scientific papers, road signs, keyboards, or glowing screens. He is solving a problem in his own world. A name must be remembered. A dedication must be read. A quantity must not be confused. The future is not present in his intention. It is present in what the tool makes possible after it leaves his hands. This is how much of history works. The people who change the world often do not know which part of their work will survive. Tyrian kings would probably have chosen their walls. Merchants might have chosen their wealth. Dyers might have pointed to purple cloth worth a fortune. Shipwrights might have trusted cedar and skill. Priests might have believed the temples would outlast ordinary men. Almost all of it passed into another form. The walls were broken and rebuilt. The wealth changed owners. The purple industry disappeared. The cedar forest shrank. The temples fell or were transformed. The ships became wrecks, sediment, scattered timbers, or nothing at all. The letters kept moving, not unchanged. That is important. They survived because they changed. Aleph became Alpha and then A. Beth became Beta and help give us be. Other signs twisted, reversed direction, changed sound, disappeared, or produced descendants that no Phoenician reader would recognize immediately. The sequence traveled even when the shapes changed. A tool designed for one Semitic language entered Greek, Etruscan, Latin, and many later linguistic worlds. Related Semitic scripts developed along their own paths. The family spread because generation after generation treated writing not as a sacred fossil, but as something that could be adjusted to fit human speech. The sailors did the same thing with the sea. They did not command it. They adjusted. A wind changes, and the sail changes. A market changes, and the cargo changes. An empire changes, and tribute changes. A harbor changes, and the route changes. A language changes, and the letters change. Adaptation was not a philosophy written in a surviving Phoenician book. It is a pattern visible in what they left behind. Tonight, somewhere on the coast of Lebanon, the Mediterranean darkens beneath the same sky ancient sailors watched. The modern lights are brighter. Engines cross the water. Satellites move where navigators once searched for stars. Containers carry more cargo in one voyage than fleets of ancient merchant ships could have carried in a season. Messages cross oceans before a sail could have been raised. The scale is different. The principle is familiar. Ports connect people who do not need to become the same in order to exchange what they know and what they have. Routes carry more than their builders intend. A useful system escapes its origin, and a small coast can matter far beyond its size when it learns how to connect distant worlds. The Phoenicians did not rule the Mediterranean. They taught themselves to move through it. They did not invent every good they traded or every idea they carried. They became masters of circulation. They did not create the first alphabet from nothing. They helped carry a mature alphabetic script across the sea until other peoples made it their own. That achievement is quieter than conquest. It has lasted longer. Our imagined ship is tied to the quay now. The crew steps ashore. Someone carries the first jar away. Someone begins counting. Someone writes a few letters. And without knowing it, the sailors have brought home something that will never remain at home again. The harbor grows quiet. The sea beyond it does not. Sleep well. Good night.